My name is Sylvia Hargrove. I am 65 years old, a widow, and for most of my life I was a quiet woman who kept her world small. I tended my garden, minded my late husband's bonsai, and worked part-time at the library sorting records until arthritis slowed my hands. People in town knew me as reserved, perhaps invisible. No one expected that I would one day stand in the center of a courtroom, staring into the eyes of my own son as he smirked, certain he had already won. That morning I walked into the courthouse with steady steps, though my chest trembled beneath my blouse. Ethan sat with his wife Marissa, both young and sharp in their tailored clothes. I could see the satisfaction gleaming in Marissa's eyes. She leaned close to him, whispered something, and he grinned as if mocking my very presence. The room hummed with quiet chatter until the judge entered. Judge Marcus Hale raised his gavel, his robe flowing as he approached the bench. Then something unexpected happened. His gaze landed on me and he froze. The gavel slipped from his hand and struck the wood with a hollow crack that silenced the entire room. I watched his lips move, and though he tried to mask it, I caught the words. "That's her," he whispered, almost to himself. The sound carried just enough for those nearest to hear. Ethan's smirk evaporated, his jaw tightening, confusion flashing in his eyes. Marissa shifted uncomfortably beside him, her confidence faltering for the first time. The room felt suspended in air, as though no one dared to breathe until the judge spoke again. I stood quietly, not revealing a single emotion, though inside me, old memories stirred like shadows long locked away. The clerk coughed, trying to cover the awkward silence. Judge Hale straightened, regaining composure, but his hands betrayed a faint tremor as he adjusted his robe. His eyes returned to me once more, holding mine longer than decorum required. Ethan finally glanced my way, searching for answers he would not find on my face. He had no idea who I truly was to this man, no idea why a judge, a figure meant to be impartial, would falter at the sight of his mother. For years, Ethan had dismissed me as frail, as someone easy to push aside. He believed the house, the little that remained after his father's death, would fall into his hands without resistance. Marissa had promised him security, power, perhaps prestige. They thought they would strip me bare, one paper at a time. Yet in that frozen moment, with a single whisper, the balance shifted. The murmur in the courtroom rose again, hushed questions passing from one bench to another. I stood still, shoulders straight, my silver wedding band glinting faintly beneath the light. It was not my habit to make scenes, but sometimes silence speaks louder than fury. That day it spoke through me. As Judge Hale raised the gavel again to begin the proceedings, I felt a strange calm settle over me. I had not come here to perform, nor to plead. I had come to show my son and his wife that dignity has weight, and that weight can change the course of a room. If you have ever been underestimated, if you have ever been told that your voice doesn't matter, I invite you to stay with me. My story is not one of shouting or spectacle. It is a story of patience, of quiet strength tested by betrayal, and of how the truth finally rose to the surface in a place where lies were meant to triumph. If you find yourself drawn to journeys of resilience and the hidden power of silence, I welcome you to listen until the end. Now let me take you back, before the gavel fell, before the whisper that left my son speechless. Let me show you the path that carried me from solitude to that courtroom, and why the judge's eyes widened when he said, "That's her." My name is Sylvia Hargrove. I am 65 years old, a widow, and the quiet rhythm of my days has long been the only anchor I have known. After the courthouse scene that startled even me, I return in memory to the life I built in silence, the one few people ever cared to see. My mornings began with the same ritual. I would shuffle into the kitchen, pour hot water over dark grounds, and wait for the smell of coffee to rise, filling the empty air of my house. That house, though small compared to the ones. The living room window overlooked the garden where a bonsai tree grew, stubborn and proud. Thomas had tended it for years, shaping its branches as if each curve carried a prayer. After his passing, it became mine to keep alive. Some days I spoke to it as though it were him, asking questions no one could answer. I would trace the rough bark with my fingertips and think of how Thomas's hands once rested there, steady and patient. That tree was more than a plant. It was memory rooted in soil, a testament. Beside my chair sat an old leather notebook with a coffee stain darkening its cover. Thomas had always kept notes in it, not only about finances, but about reflections, memories, and reminders of the values he held sacred. I never showed it to anyone, and even Ethan had no idea how much of his father's heart was captured in those pages. Sometimes I opened it, ran my hand across the warped spot where a cup had rested years ago, and let the scent of paper carry me back to nights at our dining table when, though I did not live lavishly, my meals were simple, my clothing modest. To neighbors, I was the quiet widow who kept to herself, who smiled politely but rarely lingered in conversation. Dorothy Miller, my neighbor across the street, waved whenever she saw me at the mailbox, and sometimes we exchanged pleasantries about weather or her grandchildren. But most days I found comfort in solitude. It was easier to be alone than to explain the hollow ache that lingered even years after Thomas's death. Ethan visited less and less as time passed. When he did, his eyes darted restlessly, as though he had somewhere more important to be. Marissa seldom came with him, and when she did, her perfume clung to the room long after her departure, a sharp reminder of her presence. I tried to offer them warmth, cooking the dishes Ethan loved as a boy, setting the table with the same care as when Thomas was alive, yet the laughter we once knew never returned. There was a gulf between us, and though I reached across. At night, I read. Old novels with pages yellowed and edges frayed became companions when sleep would not come. Sometimes I marked passages that spoke of endurance or love that endured past death, folding the corners down as though saving a secret for myself. The silence of the house pressed in, but I learned to breathe with it, to treat it as a blanket rather than a chain. What I did not know then was that silence can be mistaken for weakness, and kindness mistaken for surrender. Ethan and Marissa mistook my quiet life for absence of strength. They assumed that because I rarely raised my voice, I had none. But within my stillness lived an ember that grief had not extinguished, one Thomas had trusted me to guard. The notebook, the ring, the bonsai, these were not simply keepsakes. They were reminders that dignity could be worn like armor, invisible but unyielding. Sometimes I would sit at the kitchen table, the notebook open before me, the lamplight soft against its pages. I traced the handwriting, paused at the words Thomas had written near the end. Sylvia, what we built is more than walls. Protect it. Trust your judgment. Those words weighed on me differently after each reading, as though they shifted meaning with the years. At first they comforted. Later they became a call to vigilance. I remember one afternoon, the sky gray with rain, when I stood before the bonsai and noticed a new sprout curling upward. I felt my breath catch. It was proof that life, even when trimmed and shaped, finds a way to reach higher. I held the silver ring tightly and whispered to Thomas, promising him I would endure whatever storms came next. That was my life in silence. Quiet rituals, sacred objects, and an unspoken pact with the man I loved. The world may have thought me fragile, but those who dismissed me. On Sundays, I sometimes walked to the small church on the corner, not so much for the sermons, but for the stillness inside its wooden pews. The stained glass glowed when sunlight touched it, scattering colors across my lap. In those moments, I felt both invisible and profoundly seen. The hymns reminded me of Thomas's steady baritone, and though my lips barely moved, I carried the melody inside. Each walk home, I thought about how the world overlooked people like me, older, slower, quieter. Yet I also knew. I remember the evening clearly, the one that changed the rhythm of my quiet life into something heavier. I had roasted a chicken, brushed with rosemary and lemon the way Thomas liked, a recipe Ethan had once devoured as a boy when his cheeks were round and his laughter filled the kitchen. The smell of herbs lingered in the air as I set the table with a faded cloth embroidered by my mother. Candles flickered, not for celebration, but for company, for I believed if I created warmth, perhaps warmth might grow again between us. The knock at the door came sharper than expected. When I opened it, Ethan stood with Marissa at his side. His eyes darted past me into the house as though it were no longer his home, but a prize to be claimed. Marissa's gaze swept over everything with cold appraisal, her lips curling at the sight of furniture she deemed outdated. Still, I invited them in with a smile and motioned toward the table. The roast rested in the center, surrounded by potatoes and carrots. For a moment, I imagined we might reclaim something, even if only for one meal. Marissa's heels clicked against the wood floor as she circled the dining room like a cat claiming territory. She barely touched the food I served, pushing her plate aside after a single bite. Ethan tried to speak of ordinary things, the weather, work that no longer truly existed for him, but his words carried no weight. The silence between each line was louder than anything he said. Finally, Marissa leaned forward, her eyes sharp. "Sylvia," she said with calculated calm, "this arrangement can't continue. This house is too large for you. It should belong to us now. Ethan and I need space for our future, for the family we'll build." Her words were not a suggestion. They were a declaration. Ethan avoided my eyes as though he had rehearsed this moment and feared my reaction. I set my fork down carefully, folding the napkin in my lap. My voice, when it came, was steady. "This is my home. Your father built it with me. It is not yours to claim." Marissa's smile did not falter. "We'll make sure you're comfortable, of course. A small apartment, maybe. Somewhere manageable. But this house, this land, it will be ours." Ethan has agreed. It was then that Ethan finally looked at me. His expression was a mixture of shame and determination, as though he had been cornered into betraying me and yet convinced himself it was duty. "Mom," he muttered, "it makes sense. You don't need all this space anymore. Let us take care of it," I wanted to shout, to remind him of childhood summers when he played in the yard, of Christmas mornings when Thomas built fires in the hearth, of evenings when this table held our laughter. Instead, I sat still, the silver ring on my finger pressed tight against my skin. I thought of Thomas's words in the notebook. Protect it. Trust your judgment. My judgment told me this was not concern for me. It was greed dressed as practicality. The air grew heavier. I could hear the ticking of the clock above the mantel, each second like a drumbeat. Marissa reached across the table and placed a set of documents before me. "Sign these," she said softly, almost sweetly. "Transfer the deed." "The sooner it's settled, the smoother everything will be." I did not touch the papers. My hands remained in my lap, still and unmoving. "No," I whispered, but firm. Marissa's eyes narrowed, her mask slipping to reveal the steel beneath. Ethan shifted uncomfortably, caught between loyalty and manipulation, but his silence betrayed his choice. The dinner ended without dessert, without even a farewell. Chairs scraped, plates cooled, and the chicken I had prepared with hope remained untouched in the center of the table. When they left, Marissa's perfume lingered longer than her words. I sat alone beneath the dim light, staring at the documents they had left behind, the ink waiting for my name that would never be written. That night I walked to the garden, the bonsai lit by the moon. I touched its branches, remembering how Thomas once told me a tree endures by bending, not by breaking. I bent that night, yes, but I did not break. I promised him silently that I would not surrender what we had built, not to anyone, not even to our own blood. And as the candles burned down to stubs inside, I stood in the cool night air and let the silence become my vow. Later, as I cleared the untouched plates, my hands trembled, though not from age, but from the weight of betrayal. The sink filled with soapy water, and I scrubbed each dish as though erasing their presence. Yet nothing could wash away the sound of Marissa's voice, firm and commanding, as if I were nothing more than an obstacle in her way. I dried my hands slowly and returned to the dining room where the papers still lay, edges curling slightly from the candle heat. I stared at the lines waiting for my signature, the legal language heavy with the presumption of my defeat. I thought about Ethan as a boy, how he once cried when he scraped his knee, running into my arms for comfort. How had that child grown into the man who now stood silently while his wife demanded my surrender? I knew the answer, though it ached to admit it. Marissa had woven herself around him, feeding his insecurities, promising him a future built on my erasure. He had allowed it, and in his weakness, he had betrayed me. The clock struck midnight before I finally left the table. I carried the documents into the study and locked them away in a drawer. They would not touch the soil of my house again. I sat in the darkness holding the silver ring, whispering to Thomas as if he could still hear me. I will not give it up, I told him. Not to them. Not to anyone. And with that promise spoken into the silence, I felt a strength kindle inside me. It was the strength of years lived in patience, now sharpened into resolve. The morning after that dinner, I rose early and set about my chores as though routine could steady me. Yet my chest still felt raw from Ethan's silence and Marissa's command. I busied myself with sweeping the porch, straightening cushions, watering the bonsai. I tried to believe the world outside my window had not changed, but deep down I knew everything had shifted. By late afternoon, the sound of an unfamiliar car broke the stillness. I stepped to the window and saw Marissa stepping out in a tailored suit, her heels striking the pavement with authority. Beside her stood a man I did not know, holding a sleek folder under his arm. His eyes moved across my home with the same detachment one uses when pricing property. My breath caught when I saw the emblem of a real estate agency on his briefcase. They walked the yard with brisk efficiency, pointing toward the porch, the garden, even the bonsai. Marissa gestured grandly as though she already owned it, her laughter sharp against the afternoon air. I opened the door to confront them, but words failed me when I realized she was not even speaking to me. She addressed the agent discussing square footage, potential buyers, renovations. To her, I was already erased. As humiliation prickled my skin, a voice called from across the street. "Sylvia? Everything all right?" It was Dorothy Miller, my neighbor of nearly 30 years. She stood on her porch, apron dusted with flour, her hand shading her eyes. I swallowed hard, forcing calm into my voice. "Just a visit," I said, though the truth was plain. Dorothy's gaze lingered on Marissa and the agent, and something shifted in her expression. I turned back to find Marissa inside my doorway, the agent following close behind. My living room was no longer sanctuary, but stage. They moved through it with practiced steps, noting the fireplace, the hardwood floors. The agent scribbled notes while Marissa critiqued every corner. "This will need updating," she said, running her manicured finger across the mantel. "But the bones are good. With the right buyer, it'll fetch more than she realizes." I wanted to tell her to leave, to scream, but my throat closed around the words. Instead, I stood rooted, silver ring biting into my finger. The agent asked casually, "When can we schedule photos?" Marissa smirked and answered before I could speak. "Soon." Very soon, the humiliation burned deeper than any insult. They had not asked permission, nor did they think it necessary. My life, my memories, the rooms Thomas and I had filled together were reduced to square footage on a page. The bonsai in the corner caught my eye, fragile yet enduring, and I felt its presence steady me. I cleared my throat, my voice finally breaking through. "This is still my home." "You will leave now," Marissa tilted her head, amusement glinting in her eyes. "We're simply preparing, Sylvia." "Don't make this harder than it has to be." Before I could respond, Dorothy appeared at the door. She must have crossed the street without hesitation, wiping flour from her hands as she stepped inside. Her voice, though gentle, carried iron beneath it. "Marissa, this isn't right. You don't walk into a woman's home and treat it like a showroom. Sylvia deserves respect. For the first time," Marissa faltered. The agent shifted uneasily, clearly unprepared for confrontation. Dorothy placed herself at my side, her presence warm and solid. She reached for my hand and squeezed it lightly, enough to remind me I was not alone. Marissa recovered quickly, her smile sharpening. "This doesn't concern you, Dorothy." "It does when I see a neighbor treated this way," Dorothy replied, her voice unwavering. "I've lived across from Sylvia for decades. I've watched her care for this home, for her family, for her husband until the very end. You may think she's alone, but she isn't. Not anymore." The silence that followed was thick. The agent cleared his throat, mumbled something about rescheduling, and backed toward the door. Marissa's jaw tightened, her victory disrupted. She muttered a promise under her breath, something about inevitability, and swept past us, her heels striking like hammers on the floor. When the door closed behind them, my knees nearly gave way. Dorothy guided me to a chair, her arms steady around my shoulders. "Don't let them break you, Sylvia," she whispered. "You're stronger than you think, and if you ever need someone to stand by you, I will." Tears pricked my eyes, not from weakness but from the shock of kindness. I had grown so used to solitude that I forgot the strength of community. Dorothy's presence that day became more than comfort. It was proof that I was seen. That evening, as I locked the door and drew the curtains, I replayed the moment when she stepped between me and humiliation. In the stillness of my living room, I touched the bonsai's branches and thought of how roots intertwine unseen beneath the soil, supporting one another against storms. Dorothy's support was such a root, hidden until revealed by necessity. I went to bed that night not entirely alone, for the memory of her words lingered. Though Ethan had turned his back on me and Marissa sought to strip me of everything, I now knew at least one person would stand beside me when the storms gathered. That knowledge, fragile but real, kept me from despair. A week after Marissa paraded the realtor through my home, I received an envelope delivered by hand. The paper was heavy, the lettering precise, and the tone unmistakable. It summoned me to meet with an attorney representing Ethan and Marissa. The words carried the weight of finality, as though my life were no longer my own to decide. I sat at the kitchen table staring at the letter until the lamplight blurred it. The silver ring on my finger pressed hard against my skin as if urging me not to bend. When the day came, I walked into the office building downtown, its glass walls cold and reflective. The receptionist led me to a room lined with books whose spines gleamed with authority. At the center sat a man in a gray suit, his expression practiced into something between boredom and menace. He rose only slightly when I entered. "Mrs. Hargrove," he said, his voice smooth. "Philip Drake. I represent your son and his wife." He gestured for me to sit. Ethan and Marissa were already there, side by side, a united front. Ethan's jaw was set, though his eyes flickered with unease. Marissa leaned back confidently, her hand resting on Ethan's arm as if she owned not only him, but the air between us. Mr. Drake opened a folder and slid a document across the table. "This is a transfer of property deed. If you sign now, we can avoid lengthy proceedings. It will save you stress, time, and money." I glanced at the paper but did not touch it. "And if I refuse?" I asked. He smiled without warmth. "Then we proceed in court." They will file a petition declaring you unfit to manage the property. They can claim diminished capacity due to age. If the judge agrees, control of the estate will pass to your son." Ethan shifted uncomfortably, but Marissa's grip tightened on his arm. She answered for him. "It's the sensible option, Sylvia. You'll be taken care of. We'll handle everything. You just have to sign." My pulse quickened, but my voice remained steady. "This home is mine. It was built with Thomas. It will not be signed away." Mr. Drake's eyes narrowed. "You risk more than you understand. Once the process begins, every detail of your life will be examined. Your finances, your health, even your habits. Are you prepared for that?" I felt my face grow hot, not from shame, but from fury. I thought of the bonsai in the window, resilient despite years of pruning, and I drew from its quiet defiance. "Do what you must," I said softly. "I am not afraid of the truth." For the first time, Drake's smile faltered. He closed the folder with deliberate slowness, his gaze sweeping over me as though recalculating. "Very well. You'll hear from us soon." As I stood, Ethan's eyes finally met mine. For a fleeting second, I saw conflict there, a boy reaching for his mother beneath the man's facade. But Marissa shifted, pulling him back into her orbit. "We'll be in touch," she said, her tone crisp, dismissing me as though I were already irrelevant. I walked out of that office with my heart pounding, each step heavy yet certain. The city outside bustled with indifference, but I felt the weight of the battle that had just begun. They had brought in their lawyer armed with threats and legal maneuvers, but I carried something stronger: memory, love, and the dignity Thomas entrusted to me. Back home, I placed the unopened copy of the deed on the table beside Thomas's notebook. I ran my fingers over the coffee stain on its cover, hearing his voice again. "Protect it. Trust your judgment." I whispered to the empty room. "I will, Thomas. I promise." That night, I barely slept. I replayed the conversation, the pressure in Drake's tone, the way Marissa looked at me as if I were already erased. I rose before dawn, poured coffee, and sat with the bonsai in silence. Its branches reached outward stubbornly, refusing to be confined by the shape once cut for it. Watching it, I felt my resolve take root. The days that followed were restless. Letters arrived with increasing frequency, each more insistent than the last. Some carried polite wording, others sharpened with veiled threats about legal fees and court dates. I placed them all in a drawer, refusing to let their ink dictate the course of my spirit. Dorothy checked on me often, bringing pies or loaves of bread as though nourishment might shield me from worry. Her presence steadied me, but I knew this was a battle only I could face. I began to study late into the night, pulling out the old files Thomas had left in the leather notebook. Numbers, contracts, names of properties I had nearly forgotten surfaced again. Each page reminded me that our life together was not fragile. It was structured, purposeful, and far stronger than Marissa or her lawyer assumed. I realized they saw me as a woman alone in a house too big for her. What they could not see was the foundation Thomas had built, one I was determined to stand upon. By the end of that week, I no longer trembled when the mail arrived or when the phone rang with unknown numbers. Fear had thinned into something sharper: resolve. If they wanted a war in court, then I would be ready. One evening, after another letter from Philip Drake arrived with bold threats printed in neat lines, I opened the drawer where I had hidden Thomas's notebook. The leather was worn smooth by years of use, the coffee stain dark against its cover. I carried it to the kitchen table and set it before me like an old friend. For days, I had avoided digging deeper, afraid of what I might find, but now necessity pressed on me harder than fear. I opened the first pages, filled with numbers and names of properties. At first, they seemed like ordinary notes of a man who once managed our modest finances, but as I read further, my pulse quickened. There were deeds listed, accounts referenced, partnerships I had never heard him speak of. Each entry was marked with Thomas's precise hand, but it told a story far larger than the one he had ever revealed to me in words. Among the pages, folded neatly, was a letter sealed with his handwriting. For Sylvia. My hands shook as I broke the seal. The words inside were simple yet weighty. My love, if you are reading this, I am gone. Do not let grief make you small. What we built is greater than the walls around you. There is more, hidden, so that only you could find it. Trust your judgment. Protect what is ours. Remember that silence can be stronger than noise. Tears blurred the ink. I pressed the page to my chest, hearing his voice in every line. Then I turned back to the notebook. One entry caught my eye. A list of properties under shell companies, all tied to an account in my name that I had long forgotten. I rose quickly and searched the filing cabinet Thomas had kept in the study. Behind tax forms and utility receipts, I found a thin folder, its edges yellowed with time. Inside were documents, titles to apartments, small commercial spaces, even parcels of land. I sat down hard, the folder spread before me. The weight of it pressed on me like both a burden and a blessing. Marissa thought she was circling a widow with one crumbling house, but she had no idea what stood quietly behind me. Ethan believed he was inheriting 4 walls and a patch of lawn, but his father had left him something greater, something he had not earned and which I would not let him throw away. At the bottom of the folder was another letter, shorter but sharper. Sylvia, beware of greed. Not all who smile mean well. These assets are yours to protect. Do not sign them away. When the time comes, you will know how to act. I whispered into the silence. Thomas, you knew this day would come. I spent the night cataloging each document, cross-checking the notebook with the folder. Hours slipped by as I created a list, page after page. My exhaustion was tempered by a rising clarity. I was not defenseless. The house was only the surface. Beneath it lay roots deep enough to withstand any storm Marissa might conjure. The silver ring on my finger gleamed as I paused to sip cold coffee. I thought of Ethan, of how he might react when he learned that the fortune he thought to seize had always been within my hands. A pang of sorrow struck me. I did not want war with my son, but neither could I let him be dragged under by the woman who claimed to love him. At dawn, I stepped into the garden, the bonsai glowing faintly in the morning light. I touched its branches and felt Thomas's presence there. I found it, I whispered. I found what you left for me. The tree seemed to bow gently in the breeze, as though acknowledging the vow I had made. Later that morning, I placed the documents back into the study drawer, locking them securely. I folded Thomas's letter and carried it with me, pressed against my heart. For the first time in weeks, I felt steady. They could threaten, they could scheme, they could send letters filled with intimidation, but I now held proof that their power was an illusion. That night, as rain tapped against the windows, I sat once more at the kitchen table with the notebook open before me. I traced the lines of Thomas's handwriting, every word a bridge between his life and mine. The world thought of me as quiet, fragile, a woman nearing the end of her usefulness. Yet in those pages was a reminder that I had always been more than that. I was keeper of a legacy, chosen not because I was loud, but because I was steady. When I finally closed the notebook, the rain had stopped. The moon slipped from behind clouds, lighting the garden in silver. I felt no fear, only resolve. Whatever Marissa and Ethan planned, I would not yield. The hidden legacy was now in my hands, and with it came the strength to face what lay ahead. The following morning, walked into town with the folder tucked securely in my bag. At the bank, I requested old records, holding my breath until the clerk returned with files that matched Thomas's notes exactly. The accounts were still active, the properties still under my name. Relief washed over me, mingled with awe. He had trusted me with more than I ever realized, and even in death he had prepared for the battles I now faced. As I stepped back into the sunlight, clutching the folder close, I felt aligned with the man I had loved, as if his hand still guided mine. The strength I carried was not only my own, it was his, living on through me. The day after I confirmed the accounts at the bank, I knew I could not fight this battle alone. I needed knowledge sharper than mine, someone who could turn numbers and contracts into weapons of defense. That was when I called Nora Fields. She had once been a young advisor working with Thomas years ago, sharp-minded and unflinching in her pursuit of facts. I remembered her quick wit, her ability to cut through confusion, and her loyalty to the truth. I dialed her number with trembling hands, uncertain if she would even remember me. She answered on the second ring, her voice calm but curious, and when I explained, she agreed to come at once. When she arrived at my house that afternoon, the sight of her steadied me. She wore a crisp jacket, her hair pulled back, and carried a leather portfolio tucked firmly under her arm. "Sylvia," she said warmly, "you should have called me sooner." I poured us coffee and laid out the folder Thomas had hidden. Her eyes scanned the documents quickly, her brow furrowing deeper with each page. "This is significant," she murmured. "Thomas left you more than security. He left you leverage. And from what I see here, Marissa and Ethan have been hiding things from you." I leaned closer. "What do you mean?" She tapped her finger on a sheet of figures. "These accounts. See the balances? Withdrawals, loans. None of them trace back to you. They trace back to Ethan, though he doesn't realize his name is tied here. And Marissa. She has been using your son's access to funnel money for her own debts. These numbers scream desperation." The words struck me hard, though they confirmed what my heart already suspected. "She's drowning, isn't she?" Nora nodded. "Completely. Creditors have been circling. She's used aliases to secure loans. And there's more. Look at this file." She pulled another paper from her portfolio. "Ethan hasn't been working at the firm he claimed for months. He was terminated. He's been covering it up, likely ashamed to tell you." I sat back, the silver ring cool against my skin as I absorbed the blow. My son was adrift, tied to a woman who pulled him deeper with each passing day. I asked quietly, "So they want the house because they need collateral?" "Exactly," Nora said. "They're trying to shore up their sinking ship with your foundation." The room fell silent except for the tick of the clock. Nora finally set her pen down and looked at me firmly. "Sylvia, you are not powerless here. In fact, you have the upper hand. The question is whether you're willing to use it." I thought of Thomas's letter, of the words urging me to trust my judgment. My heart ached at the idea of standing against Ethan, but I knew love without boundaries becomes surrender. "I will use it," I whispered. Nora gave a small smile. "Then let's begin." For hours, we worked side by side at the table. She drew charts, mapped connections, highlighted transactions that pointed directly to Marissa's manipulations. Each line she traced was another piece of truth brought to light. She explained patiently, breaking down legal and financial jargon into language I could understand. With every page, my resolve grew. As evening settled, I brewed more coffee and lit a lamp. The bonsai in the corner cast a delicate shadow on the wall, its branches stretching like arms reaching upward. Nora noticed it and smiled. "Thomas always loved that tree. He used to say it reminded him of you, small but unshakable." Her words brought tears to my eyes, though I quickly blinked them away. "Then let it remind me now," I replied softly. By night's end, Nora closed her portfolio with a decisive snap. "You have more than evidence. You have a story that will stand in court, and Sylvia, I will stand with you through it." I walked her to the door, gratitude swelling in my chest. "You've given me back my ground," I told her. "No," she said gently. "Thomas gave it to you." I'm only helping you see it." When she left, the house felt less empty than it had in years. I sat at the table long after, staring at the neat stacks of papers, the outlines of strategy that had begun to take shape. For the first time, I felt not only defended but empowered. I was no longer waiting for their next move. I was preparing my own. As I finally prepared for bed, I paused at the window. Across the street, Dorothy's lights glowed softly, and I thought of her earlier words. Community, allies, roots intertwined. Now, with Nora beside me, I had more than memory and resolve. I had knowledge sharpened into strength. The next morning, Nora returned, this time with a briefcase filled with records she'd pulled overnight. She wasted no time. Spreading papers across my kitchen table, she showed me evidence of Marissa's dealings, credit card bills in arrears, default notices, even a letter from a collection agency, addressed to a name Marissa had used before marrying Ethan. Each page felt like a stone added to the weight I carried, but it also built a wall I could stand behind. "Marissa has been gambling with appearances," Nora explained, her voice firm. "She wears designer clothes on borrowed money, drives cars leased under shell accounts, and all of it is collapsing. She sees your home as salvation." She paused, her eyes steady on mine. "But she underestimated you, Sylvia. She thought you were alone, defenseless. She doesn't realize you have allies, and you have the law." Hearing her say it aloud gave me strength I hadn't known I still possessed. The documents were no longer lines of ink. They were lifelines, each proving I was not the frail woman Marissa imagined. By the time Nora packed her briefcase, I felt taller somehow, as though dignity itself had taken root in my bones. That night, I slipped Thomas's letter beneath my pillow and whispered into the darkness, "I am not alone." The silence of the house no longer pressed down like a burden. It lifted, carrying me forward into the battle yet to come. It was a week later when Ethan and Marissa appeared again at my doorstep, this time without warning. The knock was sharp, almost violent, rattling the glass pane in the door. When I opened it, they did not wait for an invitation. They swept inside as though the house already belonged to them. Marissa carried a folder. Ethan carried nothing but the weight of his own unease. I stood by the doorway, unwilling to yield further ground. "What is it you want this time?" I asked, though I already knew. Marissa dropped the folder onto the coffee table, papers spilling across its surface. "You've had time, Sylvia," she said coolly. "Time to think. Time to realize this isn't a fight you can win. Sign the transfer, and let's end this charade." Ethan shifted uncomfortably, his eyes flicking from me to the bonsai in the corner. He avoided my gaze, as though looking at me too long might expose his doubt. I walked forward, slowly and deliberately, and gathered the papers into a neat stack. "This is not your home," I said evenly, "and it never will be." Marissa's lips curled into a sneer. "Don't be foolish. Do you know how close you are to losing everything? You're old, Sylvia. They'll say you can't manage your affairs, and the court will believe them. Why drag this out?" Her words stung, but instead of answering, I moved to the cabinet against the wall. From within, I pulled out a folder of my own, the one Nora had helped me prepare. I placed it gently on top of hers. "If you think I have nothing, you're mistaken." Marissa frowned, her confidence faltering. Ethan leaned closer as I opened the folder to reveal copies of property deeds, bank records, and letters bearing Thomas's careful hand. I didn't need to explain much. The truth was written plainly on the pages. "This house is not all I have," I said quietly, "and every account, every document is in order. You will not take from me what Thomas entrusted me to protect." For the first time, Ethan spoke. His voice was strained, almost pleading. "Mom, you don't understand. We need this. We're drowning. If you'd just sign, we could—" "You could what?" I cut in. "Continue down the path Marissa has set for you?" "Lose yourself completely?" My voice softened, though my heart ached. "Ethan, I raised you better than this." His shoulders slumped, but Marissa's anger flared. She stepped toward the bonsai, her hand raised as if to strike its fragile branches. "Enough of this nonsense!" she snapped. Before she could touch it, I moved quickly, placing myself between her and the tree. "You will not lay a hand on it," I said, my tone sharp enough to slice the air. "This tree has endured more storms than you could imagine. And so have I." For a moment, the room pulsed with silence. Ethan looked away, ashamed. Marissa's eyes burned with fury, but she pulled her hand back, realizing perhaps that crossing that line would cost her more than she could afford. I gathered both folders, hers and mine, and pressed them against her chest. "Take your papers and go," I commanded. "This conversation is over." Marissa's jaw tightened. She snatched the documents back, her glare cold enough to chill the room. "You'll regret this," she hissed. Ethan lingered, his eyes searching mine for something he could not name. I saw the boy he once was flicker behind the man Marissa had molded. But before he could speak again, she tugged at his arm and pulled him toward the door. When the house finally fell silent, I stood for a long while, my hands trembling not from fear, but from the rush of defiance. I touched the bonsai's branches, steadying my breath. The tree was unharmed, and so was I. Later that evening, I sat at the kitchen table with Nora on the phone. I recounted every word, every gesture, while she scribbled notes on her end. "Good," she said firmly. "You showed them you're not afraid. They'll try again, but they'll think twice before underestimating you now." I looked at the notebook lying open beside me, Thomas's handwriting glowing softly under the lamp. "I didn't break," I told her. "No," Nora replied, her voice steady through the receiver. "You didn't. And you won't." When I hung up, the house was quiet again, but it no longer felt like solitude. It felt like strength. The second confrontation had ended not with surrender, but with a line drawn clearly in the sand. And for the first time in years, I felt ready for whatever came next. That night, I dreamed of Thomas. He stood in the garden, trimming the bonsai with careful hands, his voice calm, as he reminded me that strength often looks like gentleness until it is tested. I woke with his words echoing, and as I made coffee in the gray light of dawn, I realized the dream had left me with more than comfort. It had given me resolve. By mid-morning, I received another letter slid under my door, this one from Drake's office. The tone was harsher, filled with threats of imminent legal action. But instead of shaking, I felt a steadiness rise in me. I folded the letter neatly and placed it beside Thomas's notebook, then returned to the window where the bonsai caught the morning sun. Its small new sprout glistened with dew, fragile yet defiant. I whispered to the tree and to Thomas through it, "They won't break me. Not now, not ever." 2 days passed in uneasy quiet before Ethan came alone. The knock at the door was hesitant this time, softer than the one that had rattled the glass when Marissa stood beside him. When I opened it, his shoulders slumped as though the weight of the world pressed him down. He did not stride in like before. He lingered on the porch, his eyes darting toward the street as if afraid Marissa might appear at any moment. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice roughened by something I could not yet name. I stepped aside and he entered slowly, his hands buried deep in his pockets. The house felt different with only him here, quieter, as though it could finally breathe again. He glanced at the bonsai but did not approach it. Instead, he sat at the table, his eyes lowered. "Mom," he began, then faltered. He rubbed his face with his hands, weary. "Things are bad." Worse than I let on, I poured him a cup of coffee and slid it toward him, waiting for him to find his words. Finally, he spoke. "We're in debt. Not just bills, but loans. Marissa said she had a plan, that if we got the house, we could fix everything. But it's deeper than that. There are people calling me every day, collectors, threats. I don't sleep anymore." I listened quietly, my heart heavy. Why didn't you come to me sooner?" His laugh was bitter. "Because Marissa said you wouldn't understand. She said you'd judge me, that you'd think I was a failure." I reached across the table, my hand resting near his but not touching. "Ethan, you are my son. I may be disappointed in choices, but I would never see you as less than my child." His shoulders shook. He leaned back, staring at the ceiling. I don't know what to do. "She keeps telling me it'll work out, but every day it feels like I'm sinking deeper. I can't even tell what's true anymore." For the first time, his words sounded less like defiance and more like confession. The armor Marissa had wrapped around him was cracking. I wanted to pull him back into my arms, to reassure him like when he was a boy, but I knew pity would only push him away. "You have to decide whose voice you believe," I said gently, "the one urging you toward deception, or the one reminding you of the values your father and I tried to raise you with. You're not powerless, Ethan, but you have to choose." He swallowed hard, his eyes moist though he tried to blink it away. "It's not that simple. She's pregnant." The word landed like a stone between us. I sat very still, my breath caught in my throat. He misread my silence as judgment and quickly added, "It's my child." "She says it is. That's why we need stability. That's why she's pushing so hard." The silver ring pressed into my skin as I curled my hand into a fist. I thought of Nora's files, of debts and deception stacked against Marissa's name. I thought of the hidden letter warning me of greed cloaked in smiles. My heart ached for Ethan, tangled in chains he could not yet see. "Ethan," I said softly, "children are not built on lies. Stability isn't stolen. It's created with truth. If she's truly carrying your child, then protect it by standing in honesty, not in schemes." He dropped his face into his hands again, his voice muffled. "I don't know if I can get out from under her. Every time I think of leaving, she reminds me I'm nothing without her. She says no one else would stand by me." My throat tightened, but I forced calm into my tone. "You are not nothing. You are my son. And as long as I breathe, you will never be alone." Silence stretched. Finally, he looked at me, eyes red, lips trembling. For a moment, the boy I once rocked to sleep flickered in his face. He nodded slowly, as though my words had broken through the fog, if only for a breath. But then his phone buzzed. He glanced at it, and the spell shattered. Marissa's name lit the screen. He rose quickly, muttering, "I have to go." I followed him to the door. "Ethan," I called softly. He paused, his back to me, shoulders tense. "Remember who you are. You don't have to keep drowning." He did not turn, but his voice was strained when he answered, "I'll try." Then he stepped into the evening air and walked away, his figure shrinking against the fading light. I closed the door, pressing my back against it. My body shook with both sorrow and relief. Sorrow that my son was so lost, relief that at last a crack had appeared in the wall Marissa built around him. That night I placed Thomas's letter beside the bonsai and whispered, "He is wavering, love. He is still ours beneath it all." And as the branches rustled in the night breeze, I held on to the fragile hope that my son might yet find his way back. I lay awake for hours, replaying every word he had spoken, every flicker of doubt in his eyes. It was fragile, but it was something, a seed. And seeds, I reminded myself, can grow even in the hardest soil. The morning after Ethan's visit, Nora arrived with a folder so thick she had to carry it pressed tightly against her chest. Her expression was grave as she placed it on my kitchen table and unlatched the brass clip. The contents spilled out like a confession waiting to be heard. "I found something," she said, her voice low but steady. "Something you need to see." We sat side by side as she spread the papers. There were court filings, old financial records, and a series of documents tied together by Marissa's name. My heart sank as I scanned the first page. Allegations of fraud, dating back several years. Charges had been dropped after settlements, but the stains remained. She was accused of manipulating accounts, creating false invoices, Nora explained, pointing to highlighted lines. She escaped conviction, but only because her family paid restitution. It's all here, patterns of deceit, debts disguised as business losses. And Sylvia, she's doing it again. I gripped the edge of the table, the silver ring digging into my skin. Ethan doesn't know. No, Nora confirmed. From everything I've gathered, he has no idea. She's kept him in the dark, using his name when convenient, hiding her own tracks when not. He is the puppet, but she's the one pulling the strings. The words echoed through me. My son, already fragile, bound to a woman who had woven lies like a second skin. I thought of the night he sat here, eyes red with shame, whispering that he felt worthless without her. If only he could see the truth laid out on these pages. Nora slid another paper toward me. Look here, aliases. She's used at least 3. Each time debts piled up. Creditors chased her, but she slipped away, leaving others to pay. I traced the names with my finger, cold realization spreading through me. And now she's using Ethan as her shield. Exactly, Nora said. She hesitated, then added, There's more. I dug into medical records connected to one of her aliases. She visited a clinic 6 months ago. The report indicates pregnancy monitoring, but not with Ethan listed as the father. Another name appears, redacted in part, but traceable to a man she worked with briefly. Sylvia, it looks like the child isn't Ethan's. The room tilted. I clutched Thomas's notebook for steadiness. His words whispered back from the letter. Beware of greed. Not all who smile mean well. I closed my eyes, letting the truth settle heavy but clear. When I opened them, Nora's gaze was on me, steady and compassionate. You can't tell Ethan yet, she said gently, not without preparing him. The shock could destroy him if it comes without care. I nodded slowly. He deserves honesty. But he also deserves mercy. We have to be careful for hours. We studied the files, piecing together Marissa's path of destruction. Each paper painted a portrait of desperation and deceit. By midday, I leaned back, exhausted, but also sharpened with resolve. She has built her life on manipulation, I murmured, but she will not build it on my son's ruin. Or on Thomas's legacy. Nora placed her hand lightly over mine. Then we move forward, quietly. We gather, we prepare, and when the time comes, we let the truth speak louder than her lies. That night, alone with the bonsai and the soft creak of the house around me, I reread the documents again. Every line was a wound to Ethan, a cut he did not yet feel. I wanted to run to him, to shield him, but I knew that truth had to be unveiled with precision. One careless move, and Marissa would twist it into another snare. I placed the papers back into the folder, locked it in the drawer, and sat with Thomas's notebook open. You warned me, I whispered, into the quiet, and I'm listening now. The house felt heavier than before, but not with despair. It was the weight of knowledge, of responsibility. For the first time since this battle began, I realized I was not merely defending myself. I was fighting for Ethan's soul. The next morning, I walked through town to clear my mind. People nodded as I passed. Dorothy waved from her porch. The grocer smiled as he packed apples into my bag. They saw me as an ordinary widow going about her errands, unaware of the storm that brewed behind my door. It struck me then how often battles of the heart are invisible, carried quietly by those who refuse to surrender. Back home, I tended the bonsai, trimming carefully, watering its roots. Its resilience steadied me. I thought of Ethan again, the way his eyes softened before Marissa's name lit his phone. That softness was still there, hidden but alive. If truth could be shown at the right moment, maybe he would finally see who stood beside him and who stood against him. As evening fell, I placed Nora's folder beside Thomas's notebook. Together they formed a shield, one built from love, the other from unflinching facts. I sat at the table until the moonlight spilled across the floor, whispering to myself a vow. I will not let lies define us. The past she tried to bury will rise, and it will end her hold. Before I went to bed, I stood at the window watching the quiet street. The lamplight flickered, and in its glow I saw my reflection, older and lined, yet steady. I thought of Thomas again, of the years we built carefully, one decision at a time. Marissa's past was poison, but poison only spreads if left unchecked. I whispered into the night, "We are stronger than her lies." Then I drew the curtains closed, carrying with me the certainty that the truth I now held would one day free my son. The morning sun had barely cleared the rooftops when Nora and I drove across town to visit Helen Grant. Her name was etched in the history of the courthouse, a lawyer who had once carried entire cases on her shoulders before she retired. Now her small home sat quietly on a tree-lined street, but the reputation that clung to her was anything but quiet. She opened the door herself, her eyes sharp even behind wire-framed glasses. "Sylvia Hargrove," she said, her voice rich with recognition. "I wondered when you'd come." Nora and I stepped inside, and Helen led us to a study lined with books stacked 2 and 3 deep. Papers covered the desk, but the room carried a strange order, as if chaos itself obeyed her will. She motioned for us to sit, then poured tea into mismatched cups. I laid Thomas's notebook on the table, the folder of Marissa's past beside it. Helen's gaze lingered on the leather cover before she opened the folder. Her fingers moved quickly, eyes darting over every line. When she finally looked up, her face was grave. "This is substantial," she said, "but more than that, it's dangerous. If you do nothing, they will strip you piece by piece until nothing remains. If you act, you must be ready for battle." "Are you?" I met her gaze steadily. "Yes, I have no choice." Helen leaned back, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Then here's what we'll do. First, we file for protection of assets. That will freeze any attempt Marissa makes to claim your property. Next, we prepare for discovery. We'll bring her past into light, but carefully, so it cannot be dismissed as gossip." Her voice was matter of fact, but each word carried the weight of a shield being forged. Nora took notes, asking precise questions about documents, deadlines, procedures. I listened, my mind absorbing the rhythm of preparation. For the first time, I felt the law might not be a weapon only in their hands. Helen paused, then added, "I know Judge Marcus Hale. We studied together long ago. He is fair, but more than that, he remembers debts. Do not underestimate what recognition in his eyes might mean when the time comes." A faint chill ran through me at the memory of him whispering in court, "That's her." I had wondered ever since what story lay behind those words. Helen's reminder told me the past was not finished with me yet. When we left Helen's house that afternoon, I carried more than papers and plans. I carried the certainty that I was no longer alone. The battle had moved from my living room into the arena of law, and I would not stand there defenseless. The following days became a blur of preparation. Nora and I combed through records late into the night, while Helen crafted arguments with the precision of a sculptor. She coached me on how to remain calm under questioning, how to let silence work for me. "Never fill a pause with weakness," she advised. "Let them wonder what you're thinking." It's often louder than words. At night, when the house grew still, I sat with the bonsai and rehearsed her counsel. I practiced steady breathing, calm responses, the kind of composure that would not betray fear. Thomas's ring gleamed in the lamplight, a reminder that I carried not just my own strength, but his too. Letters from Drake continued to arrive, but I no longer trembled when I opened them. Instead, I placed them in a folder marked Evidence. Each threat, each demand became another piece of the puzzle Helen was constructing. The weight shifted from intimidation to ammunition. Dorothy stopped by one evening with a casserole, concern written on her face. When I explained that I had legal help now, her shoulders eased. "I'll testify if you need me," she said firmly. "I saw how she treated you." People should know her quiet loyalty warmed me more than the food she brought. By the end of the week, Helen filed the first motions. Official stamps marked the beginning of the case. When she handed me copies, I traced the seal with my fingers, feeling both dread and relief. It was real now, not just shadows, in my mind. That night, I whispered to Thomas's notebook, "We've begun." The bonsai stood nearby, its branches stretching gently in the lamplight. I thought of Ethan, of the war waging inside him, and prayed the truth would reach him before the lies consumed him. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time I felt equipped to walk it. The law was not their weapon alone. It was also mine, sharpened by truth, steadied by allies, and fueled by the silent strength that had carried me this far. The next morning, Helen called with updates. Her voice carried the same unshakable authority as the law book stacked behind her. "They'll try to rattle you with deadlines and hearings," she warned. "But remember, fear is their only strategy. You have evidence. You have allies. Walk into every room with your head high." I wrote her words on a slip of paper and tucked it into Thomas's notebook, a new line among his old ones. That day, as I watered the bonsai and watched sunlight catch on its leaves, I realized the battle had already shifted. No longer was I reacting to Marissa's games. I was preparing my own defense, my own truth. And for the first time, I felt not like a widow being cornered, but like a woman reclaiming her ground. The storm rolled in without warning, thunder cracking so close it rattled the windows. Rain poured in heavy sheets, blurring the garden into a smear of gray. I had just settled by the kitchen table with Thomas's notebook open when the pounding began. Not the storm this time, but fists at my door. I froze, listening. The knocking came again, harder, followed by Ethan's voice slurred with alcohol. "Mom!" "Open up." My heart clenched. I rose slowly and unlatched the door. Ethan staggered inside, soaked to the bone, eyes wild. The smell of whiskey clung to him like a second skin. He swayed, clutching the back of a chair for balance. "Why didn't you answer my calls?" he shouted. His words broke unevenly, anger mixing with despair. "You think you're better than me? Sitting in this house while I drown?" I closed the door against the storm and faced him. "Ethan, you need to calm down." He slammed his fist against the table, rattling the cup beside Thomas's notebook. "She was right. Marissa said you never cared. You just sit here with your memories, while I'm the one fighting to survive." I stepped closer, steadying my voice. "You are not surviving, Ethan. You're destroying yourself. Look at you." For a moment his face softened, as if he might break down and weep, but the fury returned like a wave. He swept the papers from the table, sending them fluttering to the floor. The bonsai trembled as his hand struck the shelf beside it, leaves shaking loose. I moved quickly, grabbing the tree before it toppled. "Stop this, Ethan!" I shouted, louder than I meant to. "This is not you!" He froze, chest heaving, fists clenched. The rain battered the house, thunder rolling above. Us, like judgment. I held the bonsai close, its roots steady in my hands, and forced my voice into calm. "Your father built this home for us. He left us more than walls, and I will not let you tear it apart." Something in my words pierced through him. His shoulders slumped, his fists uncurled. For a long moment he just stood there, swaying in silence. Then he whispered, "I don't know who I am anymore." I set the bonsai back carefully and stepped toward him. "You are my son." "That has not changed. But you are lost, Ethan, and you need help." He laughed bitterly, tears glinting in his eyes. "Help? From who?" You? From her? Everyone wants something from me. I shook my head. I don't want anything from you. I only want you to remember who you are before she convinced you that you were nothing. His breath caught, and for a moment the boy I raised flickered behind the man before me. But then he sagged into a chair, burying his face in his hands. I can't do this, Mom. I can't fight her. She'll ruin me if I leave. The storm outside rose to a furious pitch, rain slamming the windows like fists. I laid a blanket across his shoulders, though he hardly noticed. Then let me fight, I said softly. Let me hold what your father entrusted to me. You don't have to carry it. He looked up, eyes swollen, lips trembling. She'll never stop. She'll take everything. Not if I stand in her way, I answered. We sat in silence, the storm raging around us. His head dropped to the table, sleep overtaking him at last, the liquor pulling him under. I gathered the scattered papers, smoothing them back into order. I placed Thomas's notebook on top, its coffee stain glistening under the lamplight. When the police arrived, called by Dorothy, who had heard the shouting, Ethan did not resist. They guided him gently to his feet, asking if he had anywhere safe to go for the night. I told them to take him in until he sobered. He glanced back at me as they led him out, his eyes hollow yet searching. After they left, I stood alone in the quiet wreckage of my kitchen. The storm outside was beginning to ease, but the one inside lingered. I touched the bonsai's damp leaves, whispering to Thomas, "He is breaking, but he is still ours. I will hold the line until he finds his strength again." I cleaned the room, one paper at a time, restoring order to what had been thrown into chaos. By the time the storm ended, the house was still again. The bonsai stood unharmed, its roots deep, its branches reaching as if toward light unseen. Sleep did not come easily. The echoes of Ethan's voice lingered in the walls, his pain filling every shadow. I lay awake listening to the slow rhythm of raindrops, telling myself over and over that storms end, even the fiercest ones. When dawn finally broke, the air was clear, washed clean, and a faint light crept across the floor. I rose with resolve, knowing the night had carried me through another test. In the stillness of morning, I sat with a fresh cup of coffee and opened Thomas's notebook again. His handwriting steadied me, every word like an anchor. I promised him silently, I will not falter. I will carry this until Ethan can stand again. The house was scarred from the storm, but within its quiet lay a strength that no amount of rage could destroy. The days after the storm were filled with a strange, deliberate quiet. Ethan was gone, sobered and held for a short time by the police, and though worry lingered, I also felt relief that he was safe from Marissa's grip for at least a few days. I used that quiet to prepare. Court was approaching, and every detail mattered. Helen came each morning, her cane tapping lightly against the hardwood as she moved through my house like it was a war room. She spread papers across the table, her glasses perched low on her nose, calling out dates, statutes, precedents. Nora joined us, bringing stacks of bank statements and financial records she had unearthed. Together, they shaped chaos into strategy. I listened closely, taking notes in the margins of Thomas's notebook, the coffee stain a constant reminder of why I fought. Helen drilled me with questions, sharp and relentless. What will you say when Drake asks if you're capable of handling your finances? How will you respond when they suggest you've grown forgetful? I steadied my breath and answered, rehearsing composure until my voice no longer trembled. I will tell them I pay my bills on time. I manage my home, and I remember every detail of what my husband entrusted to me. She nodded approvingly. Good. Never let them define you by age. Show them dignity, not defensiveness. In the afternoons, Nora walked me through the financial trail Marissa had left behind. She explained how loans were stacked on false pretenses, how Ethan's name had been used without his full knowledge, how Marissa's debts could be traced like cracks through stone. Each page was a weapon forged from truth, and I learned to wield them with calm precision. One evening, after Helen and Nora left, I sat at the table surrounded by papers. The bonsai stood in the corner, lit by the soft lamp, its leaves casting delicate shadows. I whispered to it, as if to Thomas himself. "We're close now. You built these foundations, and I will not let them fall." Dorothy stopped by with a pie, her eyes warm with concern. She offered to testify about what she had seen, the realtor tours, the shouting matches, the way Marissa humiliated me in front of neighbors. "People will listen if I tell them," she said. I squeezed her hand, grateful not only for her words, but for her steady presence. Nights were the hardest. When the house grew still, doubt crept in. I wondered if Ethan would hate me once the truth was revealed, if he would see my defense as betrayal. But then I remembered his slumped shoulders, his weary confession at the table, his whispered plea that he didn't know who he was anymore. The truth might wound him, but lies would destroy him. Helen reminded me often, preparation is more than paperwork. It's presence. When you walk into that courtroom, you carry not only documents but history, dignity, and the memory of Thomas. Let them see that, so I practiced. I practiced answering calmly, practiced holding silence when it was stronger than speech, practiced letting my gaze rest steady even under the weight of judgment. The mirror in my bedroom became a witness, reflecting back a woman older, lined by time, but not broken. By the week's end, Helen declared we were ready. She handed me a small folder. Inside was a copy of the motion to protect my assets, a list of exhibits, and the sworn statements Nora had prepared. At the bottom lay the revelation that had cut deepest. Marissa's pregnancy, tied not to Ethan, but to another man. Helen's voice was firm. "We will use this only when necessary, but know that it is here. Ready." I closed the folder with trembling hands, but also with clarity. The court would not just be about property. It would be about truth, about tearing away deception that had bound my son. That night, as rain whispered faintly against the windows, I sat with Thomas's notebook open and the bonsai by my side. I laid my hand on the silver ring and spoke into the quiet. "We are ready, Thomas. Whatever comes, I will walk into that courtroom with dignity intact." When morning broke, the air felt charged with resolve. The kitchen table, once the heart of quiet meals, had become the center of strategy. Helen's cane, Nora's files, Dorothy's gentle support, all of it wove into a shield around me. For the first time, I felt not like a widow defending scraps, but like a guardian of something greater: love, truth, and the legacy entrusted to me. Court loomed ahead, but fear no longer ruled me. Preparation had carved it into something else: determination. And as I watched the bonsai stretch toward the morning light, I felt the same quiet strength in myself, rooted, steady, unbroken. On the final night before the hearing, Helen insisted we run through everything one more time. She sat across from me, eyes sharp, asking the hardest questions without mercy. Each answer steadied me further. When we finished, she closed the folder and said, "You're ready, Sylvia." More ready than most people half your age. Remember, the law isn't only about rules, it's about presence. And you have that in abundance. After she left, I lingered in the kitchen, gathering every document into neat stacks. I placed Thomas's notebook on top, pressing my hand against it like a seal. Outside, the street was quiet, a faint wind stirring the trees. I thought of Ethan somewhere out there, torn between two worlds, and whispered a promise into the night. "I will stand for you until you can stand for yourself." With that, I turned off the light and let the house rest. The next chapter waited in the courtroom, but tonight I carried peace in my heart, born not from ease but from preparation. The courthouse loomed above me like a monument carved from stone and memory. Its steps felt longer than they should have, each one echoing the weight of what I carried. I held my folder close against my chest, Thomas's notebook tucked safely inside, the silver ring on my finger catching a glint of morning light. People hurried past, lawyers with briefcases, families with worried faces. But for me, the world slowed into silence. I had rehearsed this moment with Helen until the lines between fear and readiness blurred. Now, standing before those doors, I understood what she meant by presence. Helen walked beside me, her cane clicking firmly with each step, her eyes sharp beneath her glasses. Nora followed, a steady shadow carrying files that could reshape the battlefield inside. As we entered, the hum of voices filled the air, a blend of anticipation and judgment. I drew a slow breath and kept my head high. The courtroom smelled faintly of polished wood and paper. The benches were filled with strangers waiting for their own stories to unfold, but I felt every eye turn as I walked toward the front. Ethan sat at the plaintiff's table, his posture stiff, his gaze darting between me and the folder before him. Marissa leaned close to him, whispering, her lips curled in satisfaction. Her hand rested lightly on his arm, possessive, as if she owned not only his body but his very will. Philip Drake stood beside them, sleek in a tailored suit, his expression calm but cold. He glanced at me once, the look of a man measuring an opponent. I met it without flinching, my face steady. I crossed to our table, Helen easing into the chair beside me while Nora laid out documents in neat stacks. The air seemed to thicken when the bailiff called for order. The door behind the bench opened and Judge Marcus Hale entered. He moved with the slow gravity of someone accustomed to power, but when his eyes lifted and fell on me, the rhythm shifted. His gavel slipped from his grasp, clattering against the desk before him. For a moment, silence hung heavy in the room. His gaze locked on mine, recognition dawning like a ghost from decades past. His lips parted, and though his voice was low, I heard it clearly. "That's her." A murmur rippled through the benches. Marissa's smirk faltered, Ethan's jaw tightened, and Drake's brow furrowed. The weight of the moment pressed into the room, though no one but I seemed to understand its depth. I sat straighter, not breaking the judge's gaze. Helen leaned closer, whispering just enough for me to hear, "Hold steady. This matters." Judge Hale cleared his throat, regaining composure. "Court is in session," he announced, his tone clipped, but laced with something unspoken. He straightened his papers, but his eyes flicked back to me once more before he began. As the proceedings opened, Drake stood, confidently delivering his opening remarks about my supposed incapacity, about the need for guardianship, about how I could not manage the estate left behind. His words were rehearsed, polished, dripping with authority. He spoke of numbers and dates, debts and duties, but beneath every phrase I heard the strategy Helen had warned me of. They would try to make me small, fragile, forgetful. When he finished, Helen rose slowly, every movement deliberate. Her cane tapped once as she stepped forward, her voice steady and clear. She spoke not only of evidence but of character, reminding the court that dignity did not vanish with age, that responsibility could be proven by actions, not assumptions. She gestured toward me, her words placing me firmly in the light of strength. As she spoke, I felt the room shift, a subtle leaning away from Marissa's confidence, towards something harder to dismiss. Ethan's eyes flicked to me, uncertain, searching for a truth he had avoided. Marissa's lips tightened, her knuckles whitening against the armrest. The session closed for recess soon after, the judge declaring a short adjournment. The gavel struck once more, steady this time, though his eyes lingered on me as he rose. For a heartbeat, it was as if the courtroom emptied of everyone else, leaving only him and me, bound by some memory unspoken. When he left, the murmur rose again, people whispering about the strange moment when the gavel had fallen. I gathered my papers calmly, hiding the tremor in my hands by smoothing Thomas's notebook. Inside, beneath the stain and the ink, I could almost hear his voice. Steady now. I lifted my head, ready for what came next. The courtroom had opened, and with it, the path toward truth. When the recess ended, the courtroom felt sharper, as if the walls themselves leaned in to listen. I sat with my hands folded atop Thomas's notebook, its worn leather grounding me. Helen adjusted her glasses. Nora placed the files within reach, and together we formed a quiet line of defense. Drake rose first, pacing deliberately before the judge, his voice smooth as he repeated claims of my incompetence, of supposed confusion, of the need to protect assets from my age. He gestured toward me often as if I were an exhibit. Mrs. Hargrove, he said, cannot possibly maintain an estate of this size. Her son and his wife have made every effort to care for her, and yet she resists their kindness. I let the words hang without flinching. Helen touched my arm lightly before she stood. The room shifted when she began to speak. Her voice carried clarity, each word weighted with authority earned through decades of battles like this one. Your Honor, she said, this case is not about protection. It is about exploitation, and the evidence will show precisely who stands to benefit if Mrs. Hargrove is stripped of her rights. Nora handed her the first file. Helen opened it slowly, turning pages with deliberate care. Exhibit A, she announced, loan applications filed under Marissa Kane Hargrove's name. Notice the signatures, the inflated incomes, the accounts opened without Ethan Hargrove's awareness. Drake objected, but the judge allowed the record to stand. Helen pressed on, her words a steady unraveling. Exhibit B, prior charges of financial misrepresentation, settled quietly in another state. The same handwriting, the same pattern. This is not coincidence. This is history repeating. Gasps stirred the gallery. Marissa stiffened, her smile frozen in place. She leaned toward Drake, whispering furiously, but his jaw was tight, his eyes locked on the documents. Ethan sat motionless, his gaze darting between the pages and his wife, confusion and dread carving lines into his face. Then Nora stepped forward with the final file. Helen's voice slowed, giving weight to every syllable. Exhibit C, medical records notarized confirming a pregnancy, and alongside them, a paternity report excluding Ethan Hargrove. The words struck the air like thunder. Silence followed, thick and unyielding. Marissa's hand slipped from Ethan's arm, his face blanched, his mouth opening soundlessly as though the air had been stolen from him. I sat still, breathing evenly, though my heart pounded. I remembered Helen's advice. Silence could be louder than any speech, so I kept my eyes fixed forward, letting the truth echo. Judge Hale leaned forward, his brow furrowed. Is this verified? Helen handed him the documents. Verified, notarized, and cross-referenced with independent counsel. The evidence is clear. Marissa's composure cracked. She rose abruptly, her voice sharp. This is irrelevant. This is personal. You have no right. The judge's gavel struck once, firm and final. Sit down, Mrs. Kane Hargrove. Her shoulders shook, her defiance unraveling as she slowly lowered herself back into the chair. Ethan's hands trembled where they rested on the table. He avoided her eyes, staring instead at the floor as if searching for a version of himself that had not been betrayed. Helen turned back to the judge, her voice softer now but no less powerful. Your Honor, the pattern is undeniable. Fraud, deception, and betrayal run through every record we have submitted. To suggest that my client is incapable is not only false but cruel. The truth is clear. Mrs. Hargrove has acted with dignity and composure, while those closest to her have conspired against her. The judge nodded slowly, his eyes returning to me. For a moment his gaze softened, as if he weighed not only the evidence but the years that had brought me here. We will recess until tomorrow to review the material, he said, striking the gavel again. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. I gathered my papers carefully, smoothing the cover of Thomas's notebook. My hand brushed the coffee stain, and I thought of the life we had built. Quiet, steady, rooted in love. Now, at last, the truth had been spoken aloud, undeniable. As I stood to leave, I glanced at Ethan. His eyes lifted to mine, brimming with devastation, confusion, and something else, pleading, though he said nothing. Marissa turned away, her face pale, her mask crumbling. Walking out of the courtroom, I felt the weight of years lift slightly from my shoulders, not because the battle was finished, but because the veil had been torn. The lies that bound us were unraveling thread by thread. And as the doors closed behind me, I whispered to Thomas in my heart, "The truth is here now. It can no longer be hidden." That night after court, the house felt heavier than usual, as though the walls themselves carried the echo of what had been revealed. I moved through the rooms quietly, turning on lamps one by one, each pool of light a small comfort against the shadows. The bonsai rested by the window, its leaves glistening faintly in the moonlight. I touched its trunk gently, grounding myself in its steady strength. I had just poured a cup of tea when a knock sounded at the door. It was hesitant, uneven, like someone afraid of the answer that might come. When I opened it, Ethan stood there, his eyes swollen, his shoulders hunched. He looked smaller than I remembered, as though the revelation in court had hollowed him out. "Mom," he said, his voice cracking. I stepped aside and let him in. He collapsed onto the couch, burying his face in his hands. I set the tea down and sat across from him, waiting. The silence stretched, but I did not rush it. Helen had taught me that silence could do more than words. Finally, he spoke. "She lied to me. About everything. About the money, about the debts, about the baby." His voice broke on the last word, and he pressed his palms against his eyes as though he could block out the truth. "I thought I was going to be a father. I thought maybe that would make me whole again, and now it's all gone." My chest ached, but I kept my voice steady. "It isn't gone, Ethan. What's gone is the illusion she built around you. That was never real." He shook his head violently. "But I let it happen. I ignored every warning. I chose her over you. I pushed you aside because I thought she was my future." His shoulders trembled, his voice rising with shame. "And I treated you like you were nothing." I reached across the table, placing my hand gently over his. "You are my son. That will never be nothing." He looked up at me then, his eyes raw. "I don't deserve forgiveness." I thought of Thomas, of the long nights we had worried about our boy, of the times we prayed he would find his way. I thought of the letter Thomas had left me, urging me to protect what mattered most. I tightened my hand over Ethan's. Forgiveness isn't something you earn. It's something given because love demands it. I forgive you, Ethan, but you must forgive yourself, too. His face crumpled, and he leaned forward, clutching Thomas's notebook that sat on the table. His fingers traced the coffee stain, his tears falling onto the leather cover. "Dad would hate me," he whispered. I shook my head. "No. Your father would grieve for you, but he would never hate you. He left us this because he believed in both of us. He knew we could carry it, even if we stumbled. For a long while, we sat there, the only sound his uneven breathing. Then he whispered, I knew about some of it. Not everything, but enough. I knew she was reckless, that she lied about the money. I wanted to believe she loved me. I thought if I stayed, I could make it true." The confession pierced me, but I kept my voice soft. "You were searching for love in someone who couldn't give it. That doesn't make you weak, Ethan. It makes you human. But now you see the truth, and now you can choose differently." He lifted his head, his eyes red but clearer. "What if I can't fix it? What if it's too late? I touched the silver ring on my finger, feeling Thomas near. It's never too late to turn toward the light. You can't erase what's been done, but you can decide who you will be from this moment on. He pressed his hands together, trembling. I want to be your son again. Not her puppet, not her shield, just your son. Tears pricked my eyes, but I nodded, keeping my voice steady. Then come home, Ethan. Not just to this house, but to yourself. He exhaled, the sound heavy but releasing. He leaned back, exhausted, his eyes closing for a moment as though my words had given him a place to rest. I covered him with a blanket, the same one I had laid across his shoulders the night of the storm. As he drifted into sleep, I sat beside him, watching the rise and fall of his chest. The boy I had raised was buried beneath layers of lies, but he was still there. Tonight, he had begun to surface. I whispered to the quiet room, to Thomas, to the bonsai stretching toward the moonlight. He is broken, but he is not lost. We will help him find his way back. And as the night deepened, I felt a fragile hope settle in the space between us, like the first light of dawn pressing gently against the dark. The courtroom was hushed when we returned the next morning. The air carried a different weight, one of expectation rather than spectacle. I walked in with Helen and Nora at my side, my steps steady though my heart raced. Ethan sat alone at the plaintiff's table, his shoulders slumped, his eyes fixed on the polished wood before him. Marissa had not come. Her seat was conspicuously empty, her absence echoing louder than any defense she could have mounted. Judge Hale entered, his presence commanding immediate silence. He adjusted his glasses, studied the files before him, and then looked directly at me. There was no wavering in his gaze, only recognition, and something deeper. Gratitude. He struck the gavel once. This court is now in session. Drake rose with the same practiced confidence, but his words sounded thinner than before, as though even he knew the ground beneath him had shifted. He attempted to salvage the case, speaking of compassion for Ethan, of uncertainty about my capacity, but the evidence we had placed on record overshadowed every syllable. He faltered more than once, his rhythm breaking under the weight of silence. When Helen stood, her cane steady in her hand, the room seemed to lean toward her. She recapped the evidence without theatrics, her voice calm and precise. Your Honor, this is not a question of competence, but of exploitation. The law should not be used to strip a woman of her rights because others see profit in her silence. Her words cut cleanly, leaving no room for rebuttal. The judge's eyes moved slowly between the two tables. Then he spoke, his voice even but resonant. Having reviewed the records, testimony, and exhibits, the court finds no basis to remove Mrs. Sylvia Hargrove from her rightful position as executor and guardian of her estate. Furthermore, evidence presented shows a pattern of fraudulent behavior by Marissa Kane Hargrove. This court refers the matter for investigation under criminal statute. A murmur swept through the benches. Ethan's head dropped into his hands, his shoulders shaking with what I could only guess was a mixture of shame and release. Helen placed her hand gently over mine, and I felt the tremor in my fingers still beneath her touch. But then the judge leaned forward, his gaze fixing on me with quiet intensity. Mrs. Hargrove, he said, his voice lower now as if the words were meant for me alone, though the entire courtroom listened. Many years ago, when I was a struggling law student, working nights to pay tuition and barely keeping afloat, there was a woman who helped me without asking anything in return. She gave me a place to stay, a meal to keep me going, and the encouragement to finish what I had begun. That woman was you. A silence heavier than any verdict filled the room. I felt every eye on me, but all I saw was the young man he must have been, standing uncertain at a crossroads I had long forgotten. My throat tightened as he continued. I never forgot your kindness. Today, I see that same dignity and strength, unchanged by the years. This judgment is not mercy, but justice. Justice long overdue. The gavel struck once more, final and absolute. The case was closed. I rose slowly, holding Thomas's notebook close against me. The stain on its cover seemed brighter under the light, a mark of endurance. As I turned, I caught Ethan's gaze. He looked shattered, but also freed, as though chains had slipped from his shoulders. Outside the courtroom, the air felt lighter, the sky brighter than it had any right to be. Helen and Nora flanked me as we walked down the steps, but I paused halfway, looking back at the building where everything had shifted. The words of the judge echoed in my ears, not as debt repaid, but as a circle completed. I whispered to Thomas, "You see? What we gave in silence has returned in strength." The silver ring glinted in the sun, and for the first time in many years, I felt that justice was not only possible, but present, alive in the very air around me. Weeks after the verdict, the house settled into a rhythm of peace I had almost forgotten was possible. The air felt lighter, the nights calmer, as if the storm that had raged through every corner of my life had finally passed. I still woke early, brewed my coffee, and sat at the table with Thomas's notebook, but now the pages no longer carried the weight of defense. They held plans for what would come next. Ethan returned often, quieter, humbled, and willing to listen. He no longer carried Marissa's voice in his ear, no longer flinched when I spoke. One evening, as we sat in the garden, he told me he wanted to rebuild. "Not the money, not the houses," he said, his voice steady but fragile. "I want to rebuild us. If you'll let me." I looked at him, the boy and the man folded into one, and I said simply, "Come home, Ethan. That is enough for now." His shoulders sagged with relief, and for the first time in years, I saw his smile unclouded. Helen visited often, her cane tapping against the porch as she climbed the steps, her eyes sharp and satisfied. "You did well," she told me one afternoon as we shared tea. "Few people could have faced what you did and stood as firmly." I shook my head, but she only laughed. "Dignity never expires, Sylvia." Remember that Nora remained a constant, her practical mind still guiding me through final documents and decisions. But when the papers were done, she closed the files and said, "Now you live, Sylvia. Not just survive." Her words echoed long after she left, a reminder that victory meant more than keeping what was mine. It meant learning to use it for something greater. That thought grew into the seed of an idea, and soon into a plan. With Helen and Nora's encouragement, I established the Second Porch Foundation, named after the little porch where Thomas and I had once sat in the evenings, dreaming of futures we might never see. The foundation would provide shelter and guidance for families caught in financial traps, for young people manipulated by promises too good to be true. I wanted others to have a second chance, a safe porch to step onto when their own homes felt lost. The day we opened the doors, Ethan stood beside me. He had insisted on helping, his name listed as co-director. It was his way of mending what had been broken, of stepping into responsibility with honesty this time. As we cut the ribbon, I caught sight of Dorothy in the crowd, her smile wide, her hands clapping proudly. She had witnessed my humiliation months ago, and now she witnessed something entirely different, the quiet rising of strength. At home, the bonsai thrived. New shoots had emerged, delicate but sure, reaching toward the light. Each morning I trimmed and watered it, reminded that growth is slow, fragile, and yet unstoppable when cared for. Thomas's ring gleamed as I worked, the silver catching the sun. I often spoke to him still, telling him about Ethan's steps forward, about the foundation, about the evenings when the house rang again with laughter instead of shouting. One night, after Ethan had left and the house was quiet, I sat alone on the porch with the bonsai beside me. The air was cool, the stars sharp against the dark. I closed Thomas's notebook, now filled with my own notes and reflections, and I whispered into the stillness, We made it, love. Through silence, through storms, through betrayal. We are still here. The night answered with peace, not words, and in that peace I felt the fullness of everything I had endured and everything I had reclaimed. Strength had not come from shouting or fighting louder than my enemies. It had come from holding steady, from remembering who I was even when others tried to erase me. As I rose to go inside, I paused, looking at the bonsai one last time. Its branches stretched outward, new leaves trembling lightly in the breeze. I smiled and whispered to myself, "Dignity never expires." And with that, I closed the door behind me, carrying the quiet certainty that no matter what storms might come, I would remain rooted, steady, and unbroken.